Early conditions on Earth were mostly inhabitable for living organisms. The earliest organisms that we think were on Earth probably lived in an anoxic environment, meaning no oxygen. They probably didn't use oxygen. And our very first organisms that we have fossils of by this time were starting to use oxygen. And so the conditions had to change rather drastically from creation of the early Earth to the time when we start to see organisms begin to thrive. First of all, the temperature had to cool down quite a bit. Over the first 2.5 billion years or so, the temperature cooled from very, very hot as rain started to fall. Because of cooling temperatures, oceans started to form, volcanic activity settled down a little bit. And what we began to see was Earth cooling so much that it fluctuated into several ice ages. Along with these cooler periods, we see a change in the composition of the atmosphere. So before about 2.4 billion years ago, there was very little oxygen in the atmosphere. Remember that when there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's rather warm. And as the carbon dioxide began to decrease and was replaced by oxygen, as photosynthesizers began to release oxygen, the temperature began to cool because there was less carbon dioxide, less greenhouse effect. Along with the increased levels of oxygen, we also began to see an increase in animal diversity. So first we begin to see diversity in bacteria, then we begin to see eukaryotes, and then we begin to see plants and animals. The first animals were relatively small, probably very similar to the protists that we have today, but as oxygen levels begin to rise, that provides a more efficient use of oxygen, and we start to see a plethora of diversity and then also size. Along with these shifts over several billion years and these new life forms, there was a whole bunch of physical changes to the planet. For a very long time, our land masses were shifting and moving around. Continents were reforming, mountain ranges, valleys, all of that. And so for several billion years, and even today, we have our landscape changing, although it changed rather dramatically over the time on early Earth until things started to settle down a little bit. I probably will not ask you about all of these specifics because we're talking about them very, very broadly, but just kind of keep in mind that all of these different factors were affecting the local climate, the global climate, the environments that organisms were going to be evolving in. Over the time period of the history of life on Earth, there have been five large mass extinctions. Mass extinctions are extinction events where a very large number of organisms are lost in a very short amount of time. And this is usually in the context of billions of years. So it might be a mass extinction over a few million. But when we think about the overall time frame of life on Earth, we're talking about in a relatively small time frame, a large amount of organisms that were lost. We will talk about a couple of these later. You don't have to know exactly what happened in each of these, but just keep in mind that at each of these mass extinctions, they basically ushered in new trends in living organisms. So for example, at the end of the Cretaceous, this is the event that killed the dinosaurs. It removed pretty much all of the large land animals, and at the time they were the dinosaurs, and that opened up all of these environments for smaller animals, the small reptiles, the small mammals, to diversify into those different environments. These events are such a big deal that they often act as boundaries between geologic time periods because they mark such a huge change in the characteristics of life on Earth. Many people believe that we are in the middle of the sixth mass extinction, this one due to human activity. So if you are in a semester where we've already done ecology, you will have known that starting with the Industrial Revolution, we have seen an increase in carbon dioxide, increase in population growth, and coinciding decrease in the number of species on Earth. If you haven't done the ecology unit yet, if you're in the spring semester, then we're going to get to that. We're going to talk about how humans are potentially bringing about this mass extinction. So our very, very first cells are going to be our prokaryotic cells. They evolved during what we call the Archean eon. And this is where our microbial life began to flourish. So early Earth, all the water was in the atmosphere, but as the water began to cool, it began to rain. And it rained for a few million years and eventually accumulated rain in what would be the Earth's oceans. So all life on Earth, early life, is going to come out of these oceans. We talked about the reducing atmosphere hypothesis, where some people theorize that early life came out of small ponds or small pools, isolated areas that had the right conditions. Other people theorize that life evolved around deep sea vents, where there was a plethora of chemical energy that they could use to, or that could power the generation of early molecules, and then the early organisms could use as autotrophs. But no matter how they evolved, they likely started in the water. And bacteria were our earliest prokaryotes, our earliest domain, and they split off relatively early from the Archaea group. Way back when life first evolved, it was very likely to have been anoxic or lacking oxygen. We know that there were very little oxygen in the atmosphere at the very beginning, and so the earliest organisms would have probably evolved in an anoxic environment, and very likely oxygen was poison to them. Oxygen gas actually can burn, is a problem for some organisms, and so likely when the change in the atmospheric composition, when we started to decrease carbon dioxide, increase oxygen, probably caused a lot of organisms to die off. So while we think that they were anaerobic organisms, meaning they performed respiration without oxygen, biologists are still unclear as to whether these organisms were heterotrophs or autotrophs. So heterotrophs are organisms that obtain energy from chemical bonds in molecules they consume. In other words, they have to eat their molecules. They have to get their energy containing molecules from somewhere else. So if we think about the process of cellular respiration in heterotrophs, they have to consume glucose that they get from another organism. So if we think about our herbivores, they have to get their energy from the plants that they eat, and they're eating glucose that is in those plants. So they cannot fix their own energy into chemical bonds. Autotrophs, on the other hand, can fix their energy, generally from sunlight or an inorganic chemical source. So we are familiar with our photosynthesizers, who are fixing carbon dioxide into glucose bonds, absorbing that sunlight, using it to build chemical bonds. But there were other organisms who could use molecules such as sulfur-containing, nitrogen-containing molecules as an inorganic energy source and convert that energy, or use that energy to store energy in their cells that they can use. The first fossils were probably cyanobacteria, which are autotrophs. I'll show you a picture of them in a minute. As these cyanobacteria began to photosynthesize, they began to affect the composition of the atmosphere. So as they pulled in carbon dioxide, replaced it with the oxygen that they released. And this would have taken a really long time to get oxygen levels to what they are today. They actually got to much higher for a short period of time. So we'll talk about cyanobacteria in a minute. No matter what the organisms were, whether they were heterotrophs or autotrophs to begin with, the first evidence of life comes from those cyanobacteria. So The earliest fossils that we have come from about 3.5 billion years ago, which means that life would have had to begin to form prior to that. So it's estimated that early cells began somewhere between 4 and 3.5 billion years ago. And those fossils resemble cyanobacteria. So if we look at this modern picture of cyanobacteria, we have these chains of green bacteria. These are photosynthesizing bacteria. And then we see this fossilized prokaryote that looks very, very similar. In fact, we have a second or a different picture of a fossil. This is a stromatolite. So these fossils are thought to be layers of cyanobacteria. This is something that cyanobacteria still do. Down on the bottom, we have modern stromatolites. And if you cut a slice in these stromatolites, they look like these layers. These are basically layers of sediment and dead cyanobacteria. So the cyanobacteria grow in a film, they die, they're covered with sediment, and then another layer of cyanobacteria grows on top, they die, layered with sediment. And so what happens is they actually calcify and become fossils. And part of that is the production of carbon dioxide leads to the calcification and fossilization. And so we have these layers of these early cells. So as the cyanobacteria and other photosynthesizing organisms began to do well, they began to pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it into oxygen. Now this was really, really advantageous because it meant that they were never out of food. There was so much carbon dioxide in the air that they could constantly pull the carbon dioxide from the air, convert it into a chemical source of energy, and then as a byproduct, they were releasing oxygen. So that shift from the carbon-dominated atmosphere to the oxygen-dominated atmosphere likely caused one of the very first mass extinctions. It likely killed all of the anaerobic organisms, all of those that could not survive in the presence of oxygen, because remember, they evolved away from oxygen. And any surviving anaerobic organisms that remained were restricted to those environments that didn't have oxygen, such as underground. So the dominant organisms on Earth started to be the ones that could do what is now the process of cellular respiration, using oxygen to convert chemical energy in glucose to chemical energy such as ATP in the cell.